Alright, so today I'm just running the camera and stuff by myself, so I am going to have to stand up every now and then. But yeah, so today we're going to be going over Chalicotheres and the two different groups of them, and why there might have been two different groups, and also why did that happen? Why are there two very distinct groups of this type of animal? Before we get started, remember the Headwaters Science Center, we're open 9:30 to 5, 6 days a week. Monday through Saturday. And on Sundays, we are open 1 o'clock to 5. And it's nice, it's warming up a little bit this week. So as much as we'd love you to come in here, feel free to enjoy a little bit of that nice weather as well. So, Chalicotheres. They are a very odd animal from the Cenozoic, related to stuff like horses, tapirs, and such. They're a very odd perissodactyl mammal. If anyone remembers from some of my previous live streams, perissodactyls are an order of mammals which we often refer to as the, I believe it is the odd-toed ungulates. Often simplified to the odd-hooved, even though not all of them have hooves, as we're going to get into these. They're in the family Chalicotheroididae, which is the Chalicotheres. And there are two subfamilies to this. So there is Chalicothereinae and Schizotherinae. And those two groups, those two subfamilies, are a great example of a biological concept called parallel evolution. Generally, we're all passingly familiar with convergent and divergent evolution. Parallel evolution is something that you don't often hear about. I think I only really had it slightly touched upon in my evolution course at BSU. It really is something that tends to either get lumped in with divergent evolution or they kind of gloss over it. So we're going to actually talk about this. What is parallel evolution? So, parallel evolution is when two animals evolve, and they are typically closely related animals, evolve doing the same thing, and oftentimes in the same habitat. They will share a common ancestor often, but not always. Sometimes there are two different groups of animals that are evolving to do the same thing and competing. If you remember from my live stream on Paraceratherium, oftentimes this ends with the rule of competitive exclusion coming into play, which is eventually someone's going to do that job in the ecosystem better and outcompete the other one. And just to go over those other two forms of evolution for you, divergent evolution is when a population diverges into two distinct sort of phenotypes. A great example are the Galapagos Finches. They evolved from only a few ancestral species, and many of them are closely related but do very different things. Some eat very large, durable seeds, others are insectivores. And since they're not doing the same thing, they have diverged to be two very different animals. And then convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is where two very different animals with different ancestors oftentimes will evolve to do similar things or the same thing, whether it be in the same or different ecosystems. Typically different. A great example of convergent evolution, we actually have two animals here. Those would be the Boas and Pythons as far as snakes go. They are both groups of very large constrictors, but boas are native to South and Central America. Pythons are native to Africa, Asia, and Australia. And while they look similar, that is because they've evolved to do the same thing in two different environments. They're both generally large-bodied, thick snakes with large muscular heads. So, back on Chalicotheres, though. Chalicotheres lived from around 46.2 million years ago up until actually really recently, 781,000 years ago. There were still some Chalicotheres around the same time as animals like Australopithecines. Our direct ancestors were roaming Africa. And these animals got pretty widespread. In their heyday, Chalicotheres were found everywhere from North America to Eurasia and Africa. They were remarkably successful. And some of the traits that make them rather unique among perissodactyls are that they didn't actually have hooves. What they had were claws, much like a ground sloth, and they would have just massive claws on their feet, which helped get grip on the ground, and we're going to go into a little bit more on one of these groups, what those claws may have been used for. A cool trait that they all share, both of these two different families, is that they don't have any upper incisors or those front teeth. And there's decent evidence, much like giraffes today, they may have had a muscular tongue to sort of grab food with. Their necks were actually had a remarkable bit of vertical movement, so it was easier for them to tilt their head back without discomfort. And much like most perissodactyls, they have a single-chambered stomach. So there's only one chamber, not like a cow, which has multiple different chambers. And these animals are what we call hind gut fermenters. They have a very long digestive system, so that the food passes through a very long channel to get out to the back end of the creature, giving them time to really extract nutrients from their food. While it's not the most efficient way to get nutrition out of plants, especially, it is a pretty widespread use. Everything from rhinos to elephants still do hind gut fermentation today. When you get to a certain body size, it does become rather efficient. And then other things about these is they could range from stuff like large antelope, like a kudu-sized animal, all the way up to being like large draft horses. Around 350 kilograms was the weight that I found, pardon for the metric there. Another thing about these is they're relatively rare fossils. We only have a few relatively complete Chalicotheres of either of these subfamilies, which does seem to imply they either were not very numerous or they may have been solitary animals and tended away from areas where preservation was easier. So, what do they eat? So these animals, and that's going to influence this next bit here. So these animals ate vegetation, obviously. They're herbivores. And generally leaves, woody bits of plants, and the fruit. And their habitat, they really wanted trees around. These animals were great high browsers. So sort of like giraffes do today, they were going for the higher bits of trees for that slightly nicer food. So their habitats, they were going for scrub forests, fragmented forest grasslands, or simply deciduous forests. So that would be broad-leaved or flat-leaved trees, flowering trees. Now, what happened with these animals is rather interesting. Is around 30 million years ago, in the fossil record, we start seeing these two distinct groups of these animals, these Chalicotheres form. And the more interesting thing about it is the two distinct groups seem to kind of be doing the same thing ecologically. They're both doing a different approach for high browsing. And they're both living in these same areas. Areas like, I believe Central Asia is where this split occurred. So the Chalicotherians really look kind of odd. And I'm going to have to get up and zoom in on the camera for this. So, the Chalicotherians, you'll notice, have a very sloped back. They had much shorter hind legs, and they had these very long front legs, almost like gorilla arms. And they actually walked on their knuckles, like a gorilla. And that was to protect their claws, so they wouldn't dull them on the ground. Because they used those claws, much like Therizinosaurus, giant sloths, to reach and grab food and pull it to their mouths. They had shorter necks, and actually their hips and lower backs were specialized to support their weight, so they probably spent a lot of their day sitting, just browsing and pulling food to their mouths. Whereas the Schizotherians, these animals were rather interesting. So they walked what we would call plantigrade, or flat on the bottoms of their feet. And actually, much like cats today, had retractable claws. They had specialized tendons and bones so they could retract those and keep them off the ground. They also grew these really long necks, almost like giraffes or okapis today. And they would use those to be able to reach up to food without having to rear up onto their hind legs. They also, an interesting thing that we're not sure why, they tend to have these bony domes on their heads. We don't know exactly what those are for. They may have been used in headbutting or display of some kind, but we don't quite have enough fossils to really know. The Schizotherians are also relatively flat-backed animals and look a lot more kind of like a horse if you really look at them. These animals really are remarkably odd, and given that everyone who's been doing the live streams recently here, we've been talking about animals that we may consider ugly or pretty and why we might consider one or another. The Chalicotherian family in general, both the Schizotheres and the Chalicotheres, they're definitely odd-looking animals at least. They actually do kind of look like you just kind of mashed parts of other animals together and threw it out there and saw what stuck. But the thing is, they really do just look odd compared to modern animals. I would like to point out that animals don't typically evolve for the overt aesthetic. They may evolve display structures for aesthetic within their species, but they don't evolve to be aesthetically pleasing to us. Evolution tends towards what works, and these two body plans both worked. And this comes to the question of why the two groups of Chalicotheres, and I think that is a rather poor way to word it. I'm going to rather say, how did these two groups of Chalicotheres occur, and how come they were able to both persist together in competition? And the big thing was they lived in ecosystems that generally could support more large animals, and since there was enough food to go around, they were less likely to be subject to the rule of competitive exclusion. Now, they did go extinct, and they think that they went extinct due to competition with animals like some artiodactyls or the even-toed ungulates. Stuff like giraffes and that family of animals may have been able to outcompete them as browsers, as they had a more efficient digestive system and ability to process their food. And unfortunately, these animals went extinct. Generally, that's, I think, all I've got today. I know it's a relatively short live stream compared to my usual one, but I did want to just cover these. They are an interesting animal, and you don't often see these in media, and I felt they need a little bit more press because they're remarkably interesting looking, and their biology and evolutionary history does bring up some interesting principles. We may actually circle back to these and go more in depth on the two subfamilies at some point, because I do think they should be covered in a little bit more detail. I just wanted to broach this subject today, kind of do the general stuff, and we're going to, actually, you know, we are going to get more specific. Okay, in the future, I'm going to do more research, and we're going to cover each of these groups individually. But yeah, hopefully everyone enjoyed this kind of a little bit more informal, a little bit shorter live stream. And remember, stay warm, but also enjoy it. I know it's weird to say 20 degrees is warm or 30 degrees is warm, but it's nicer than what we've had in the past few weeks. So let's go outside